Well, welcome back to another lesson of Duties of Christian Fellowship. This is lesson number 17 as we go over rule number 9 that John Owen lays down for us. This rule, Owen states, believers are voluntarily to contribute and share in temporal things with those who are truly poor in a way that is suitable to their necessities, wants, and afflictions. Again, a number of proof texts that Owen notes. I'll note just a couple of them. 1 John chapter 3, verses 17 through 18. If anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 through 2. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed to the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper. Romans chapter 12, verse 13. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, especially to the household of faith. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. And then Hebrews chapter 13, verse 16, do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. And he lists a number of proof texts here that we didn't get into, about 2 pages worth, that he notes and that he quotes there. So you can, if you have the book, go look those up, read them, meditate on them. They're wonderful. But again, we see that this duty is relatively easy to see and proven from the scriptures themselves. That we are to share what we have with those who are in need, and especially with our brothers and sisters who have a need, and dealing with their necessities, their wants, and their afflictions. Now, before we dive into more of what Owen says, just a brief word about what he says here about their wants and afflictions. Wants there, I don't believe, are whatever these people desire to have, but wants more in what they are wanting, that which they don't have and possess for their own well-being. All right, so here, even as Owen will talk about, or at least allude to, our giving to the poor isn't to satisfy all of their desires, right? It's not a we ought to be covering all the luxuries of life and what we give. That's not what Owen hits at. That's not what the Bible hits at. But there's still this principle that we must share what we have to care for our brothers. Now, Owen opens his explanation by talking about how this is a test. All right, this rule serves as a test both to those who are poor, but also to those who stand to give. And it's unique and helpful, instructive, how Owen pastorally deals with this. All right, he notes that as the Bible reminds us that we will always have the poor amongst us, he reminds poor saints, poor brothers and sisters, that this is a test for them. All right, that their poverty is a test to test their contentedness in Christ and a trust in the divine sovereignty of God, who is able to care for all of our needs. Those of us, myself and probably most of you included, who have gone through times of poverty, we know how testing and trying this can be. All right, to depend upon the provision of the Lord. And I remember, just a funny story in my own life, that shortly after my wife and I had gotten married, that we were not well off by any stretch of the imagination. We barely had any money. But somebody had gifted us some money, and we thought, this is wonderful. And we ran into a poor guy who was asking for some money. And, and I was talking to him and reminding him, the Lord knows how to care for you. He's such a good provider. You just need to trust the Lord, and, really tried to encourage him with whatever words I possibly could. I can't remember, maybe I gave him a little money on the side as well. All right, but then we got home from running this errand where we had run into this homeless person, and we found out that we were pregnant with our first son. And of course, my natural inclination here was, how am I going to provide? All right, I could barely provide for my new wife. How am I going to cover this? How am I going to deal with this? And it was so ironic to me to see how just moments before I had money in my pocket, and I was encouraging a poor man and telling him, the Lord is sovereign, and he knows how to provide for his own and how to care for his people. And then the next minute, all right, when push comes to shove, when all of a sudden that money doesn't feel like a lot in my pocket because I've got my firstborn son on the way, my firstborn child, and I'm wondering, how am I going to provide? And I thought, what a challenge. How ironic that here I was one moment trying to assure a man who had no automobile, who had no home, who barely had clothes on his back, and how quickly I was thrust into that test as well. All right, so those of us who have lived in times of poverty, we know the difficulty, the trying, testing nature that this can be. Are we truly contented in Christ? And do we really trust the sovereignty of Christ? But Owen just as carefully reminds us that not only is this rule a test for those who are impoverished, but that this is also a test for those of us who have plenty. And the test that we are faced with this particular rule is the question of how freely are we willing to part with our things, and particularly our money, for the sake of Christ. Right? This giving nature and caring for one another has such a reciprocal challenge to it, doesn't it? As Owen notes, that it tests the poor person on the one hand. All right, are you going to be content with Christ and the sovereignty of God? But it tests those who have a lot on the other hand in saying, are you going to be willing to freely part with that which you have for the sake of Christ? And so Owen notes, regardless of where you fall in the spectrum, the one being helped or the one helping, that this indeed tests, it challenges our faith to cause us to look inward and to ask, who are we trusting? Now Owen carefully goes on in his explanation to talk about the equality of our wealth within the church. And he uses, in the beginning, the example in the Old Testament, and particularly the Israelites when they went out to gather manna, right, that the Lord provided for all of them. And he provided, as it were, equal measures for each person in the land of Israel, that there wasn't one who had an overabundance, and there wasn't one who had such an insufficient lack, but rather all, according to their stations and according to their abilities, right, that they collected this, and that they ate of it. And even those who couldn't collect, all right, that there were others who collected on their behalf in order to give them manna. So he shows this principle of equality, of equity that was running throughout the Old Testament, and he notes that this does get brought over to the New Testament as well. That Paul, even as he's commending the giving in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 15, that he reminds the church in Corinth of how the Israelites gathered manna. And he notes that in a similar way, this is how we are to treat our finances one with another. He also uses as an example of this Acts chapter 4, verse 35, all right, where we read that the saints in the early church had all things in common, that those who were wealthy, that out of the abundance of their wealth, they were caring for all the needs and the difficulties of their brothers and their sisters. And of course, that's where we first read of Barnabas, the son of encouragement, who goes and he sells his field, and he gives all the proceeds in order to help the poor within the church. And then Owen doesn't mention this, but we all know the story that comes after that, Acts chapter 5, where Ananias and Sapphira deny, right, that they're giving everything to help relieve the poor. And they claim to be giving everything that they sold their field for. And then, of course, that isn't right. And so important is this idea of giving cheerfully to aid, right, that these are actually the first two that are brought under the covenantal curse in the New Testament and killed for lying to God, for lying to the Holy Spirit. So we see this equality both in the Old Testament and the principles carried over into the New Testament. But Owen is very careful. He's very helpful to give some necessary qualifications here. All right, and the first qualification that he gives is that to say that we are to voluntarily contribute a share in the temporal things with those who are truly in need, as he says that in no way does this deny our individual right to dispose of our earthly things. All right, the confession of faith in chapter 26, as it deals with the fellowship or the communion of the saints, notes this, that though we have a share in one another's gifts and graces and even in one another's wealth, that in no way does this mean or destroy the right to personal property and owning things. And so Owen notes this, right? The very command to give liberally and cheerfully teaches this principle that we have the right to dispose of our earthly things, all right? That we have the right to govern over them, so to speak. So that's an important qualification. So Owen says we have the liberty to dispose of our own belongings, but he says we do not have the right to take our earthly belongings and use them entirely upon ourselves. We have the right to private property, but we don't have the right to use our private property entirely upon ourselves. And he notes that wonderful and challenging parable from Luke 16 of the dishonest manager. Remember that guy who took these accountings and finds out that his boss is going to fire him? And so he calls in individuals who owe debts and he lessens the debt that they owe. All right, sometimes dishonest or the shrewd manager is what he's referred to, right? And what he does by relinquishing these debts is that he does this, as Jesus says, because he knows that, right, when he no longer has anything, that he's going to be received into people's houses. And then Jesus offers this harsh rebuke to the children of the kingdom. And he says, look, basically the children of darkness show themselves to be far wiser in the way that they spend money and in the way that they invest than the way that children of the kingdom often do. Now, without getting into the muck of some of the challenges and the difficulties here in this parable, all right, you just think of the way that worldly people so often use their finances and their wealth to maximize their pleasure, to make the best investments that they can in this day and age, that they are very, very shrewd with their wealth. And Jesus in this parable is not saying, look at the people of the world and how they invest in shrewdness and mimic them. But what he is saying is that as children of the light, that we need to be shrewd with the way that we deal with our finances, that we're not to necessarily follow the ways of the world, but that we need to be very, very careful with how we invest our funds, with how we use them. And Jesus uses this parable to say that the best investing that we can do with our finances is to invest in other people, to care for the needs and the wants and the insufficiencies and temporal things for our brothers and our sisters. And he tells us that's the shrewd investing that we ought to be concerned with, is investing in the needs of those around us, right? That we are to use our mammon, our money, to make friends. And so Owen notes this parable, Luke chapter 16, to note that we don't have a right to spend our money entirely upon ourselves, but that we must, rather than looking inward, even with our finances, we must look outward. Right? We must see how can we bless people with the material possessions that the Lord has given to us. All right, now the next qualification that he does note here, which is helpful, is he says, if the Lord in his kindness has given you both your portion and your brother's portion, right, then you ought to give to your brother his portion. Indeed, that's the way that the Lord often works according to his grace, that he will heap double blessings upon one individual, that he won't necessarily prosper or bless another individual in order that the one who has the greater share can go and share a portion with his brother. And Owen says we ought to keep this in mind. And then the final qualification that is interesting is that Owen does say that this is a rule that has particular application or necessity to those who are rich. Right? When you think of your brothers and sisters, undoubtedly we sometimes think of people through economic lenses. We know who the more prosperous ones are. We know who are more in poverty. We know who the Lord has financially blessed, and we know those who are barely holding on. And in light of that, Owen says that those rich amongst us, that you have a particular duty and necessity to make sure that you are caring for the temporal needs of your brothers and of your sisters. But Owen also says, even of the poor, right, that this doesn't mean that you don't give anything, all right, but even as Ephesians 4 notes, that let the thief no longer steal, but let him labor and so give, that even the poor and those who are in poverty, that they are to give. He notes about that widow, right, who gave her 2 mites, that both her 2 mites were both required, but they were also accepted. And so we have a duty of aiding those according to the way that the Lord has prospered us. And the last qualification Owen notes here, right, is that this is a particular duty on the rich. And then, but that doesn't absolve those who are poor in poverty from relieving the needs of the saints either. And then he talks about the rule in his explanation here, right? That our giving is to be driven both by necessity and also by ability. And he doesn't really flesh those rules out. But you do note that as he states this rule, that he says those who are truly poor, all right, that we are to truly help those who really cannot help themselves. All right, this doesn't mean that the one who refuses to work, all right, that we just say, well, let me relieve you of some duties, right? Paul says elsewhere that if you don't work, you don't eat. There are individuals who, due to physical limitations, mental abilities, can't work or can't find a job, right? Well, we don't use Paul's command there, right? Well, if you're not going to work, you're not going to eat against them, against those who truly and diligently try to do what they can, all right? They must be truly poor. They must be those who otherwise can't help themselves in that regard that we want to aid that, but also in ability, all right? That is that we also need to evaluate our own situations and circumstances. So, very, very simple case here is that it wouldn't be appropriate of me to take all of the grocery money that I use to feed my wife and children and say, well, we're going to go without food this week to help this brother or sister who's in pain. All right, that as individuals we still have responsibilities, we still have necessities. We need to care for our own household before we can begin caring for others' household. Now, granted, there is a great deal of subjectivity here. All right, the providing for one's household, what technically falls under that? Is that only bare necessities and essentials, or does that cover other things? Is it right for people to say, well, I can't give as much to the poor as I wish I could because I need to save up for my children's college education? All right, well, those things need to be weighed out very carefully, prayerfully, winsomely, dealt with from a scriptural perspective to understanding these things. What does it mean to provide for your own household before providing for others? We want to keep the proper balance. We don't want to become so selfish and inward and greedy and self-centered and covetousness, right, that we just don't see that we have any finances to help people. But we also don't want to neglect our duties and responsibilities. So these things need to be weighed out very carefully. So this is the rule that Owen lays down. He follows the rule by listing 5 motivations to encourage our giving to those who are poor and helping relieve their burdens. And the first one is to simply remember the great love of God to us. All right, that God has treated us and God has aided us and God has helped us in so many innumerable ways that He's just lavished these things upon us. And we have the joy of following suit and lavishing things upon others as well. Right now, one principle of giving that we often hear is that we won't give to people unless we know that they're going to spend it in a way that is encouraging or right. All right, now, different Christians have different opinions here. My particular take on that is that when I seek to give to those who are in need, I seek to give with no strings attached. All right, I think of the many bounties of blessings that the Lord has given to me, and that there are times, many times, when I squander the gifts that the Lord gives to me. But in His kindness, the Lord continues to give. And so we might have an opportunity to spontaneously give to a stranger, to someone we don't know. I don't technically think that it's appropriate to always use as an excuse. Well, I don't know where this person's going to spend this money, so I'm just going to keep it for myself. All right, I'm just going to go spend it on myself. All right, sometimes we can think that we're more intelligent than the command to give. All right, but we need to deal with that. Now, that doesn't mean we just go throw money out left and right either. Again, a principle of wisdom is needed here. But personally, when I tend to give, I try to give with an open hand, open heart, with no strings attached. And if that individual goes and they use those finances and they squander them and they don't use them in a way of faithful stewardship, all right, I tend to think that they will answer for that one day. But that it is our great joy to share, and to share with those, especially who are undeserving, because as Owen lays down the first motivation here, the love of God towards us in Christ. We are undeserving of all the love that he gives to us, and we squander that love repeatedly, and yet the Lord continues faithfully and graciously with us. The second motive that he lists is the glory of the gospel is greatly honored when we do these things, right? When we give cheerfully, when we give sacrificially. So the gospel is greatly honored. This is a gospel ordinance and injunction, and we do well to follow it. The third motivation that Owen notes, and I find this one to be particularly beneficial, as he says, the union that we have with Christ and the common inheritance that we have with each other. Right? That this ought to motivate gracious and sacrificial giving for people, because we are all united to the same Lord. And we all have the same common inheritance, and we're all aiming for the same hope and the same glory. And because we share all these common things together, we ought to share commonly our wealth as we are able to as well. So Owen lays that down as a principle, all right, that he notes our union with Christ and the common inheritance that we have. The fourth motivation that he lists is that what we do in this way for others, that we do unto Christ. As Jesus taught, and we've already been over it, Matthew 25. Whatever you do to the least of these brothers of mine, you do to me. And when we give, and we help support others, right, we are giving to Christ. And we are giving for his renown and for his praise and for his glory. And so Owen says this ought to motivate us, right, that even when we give a cup of cold water in the name of Christ, so we're doing this unto Christ. And so all of our giving is given as it is given unto Jesus. And then the fifth motivation are just the promises that are attached to it. Right? You think of the many promises that come. The Lord loves a cheerful giver. Right? You want the love of God, you want the experience of the love of God, then cheerfully give. All right? That the one who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. The one who sows generously will reap generously. Right? That there is a sense in this, right, in the economics, if you will, of grace, that the more we give, the more we get. That we get innumerable blessings, we get innumerable promises, that the Lord often favors and returns what we have given. Right? So we have all these promises that are attached. So freely we have given, freely, or freely we have received, and therefore freely we should give of so many things in life. So Owen says, think of all the promises that attach themselves to this for our encouragement and motivation to give. Now, as he concludes his motivations, he notes the means by which we are to give to others. And I think this is helpful and instructive as well. That Owen speaks both of a formal giving to others, but also of an informal, right? That is a disciplined giving. And he notes the office of deacon here, right? As we hold the biblical doctrine of deacon, the deacons are raised up to help serve the tables, to help relieve the oppression and the difficulties that individuals are facing. As we think of the longest chapters in the Bible that deal with giving, 1 Corinthians 8:9, right? This deals with the money that was collected to relieve the saints of the burden during the famine in Jerusalem. Right? The deacons are committed for the task of collecting and distributing finances in the name of the church to those who are in need. And so we have the duty to give to our deacons that they might be able to turn around and give freely as well. So Owen notes in this formal giving, this disciplined giving, right? At our church, we collect a diaconal offering after we take the Lord's Supper every month. And that money is collected and then distributed to those who are in need through the gifts and the graces of these men who've been raised up, called, qualified, and ordained and installed as deacons. But Owen also notes, and this is helpful to remember, right, that our giving to the deacons, and then as they in turn go out and give, that doesn't absolve our duty, right? But that we are to give spontaneously, that we are to give private charitable giving as well. And of course, one of the clearest texts here is the 1 John 3, roughly verse 17 area, right, where John says, if you see your brother in need and you have the world's goods, then you who have the world's goods, you are to give to your brother. All right, so this is the private, this is the spontaneous, this is the non-disciplined, if you will, in the sense that it's not routine. But if a need arises and you have the opportunity to meet it, you need to meet it. So Owen lays down here this 9th rule, that believers are voluntarily to contribute and share in temporal things with those who are truly poor in a way that is suitable to their necessities, wants, and afflictions. Again, I hope this lesson has been beneficial to you. I have certainly enjoyed it myself, and I hope you have a wonderful day.